Do you remember when there was pretty genuine bipartisan support in this country for the idea of closing down the prison at Guantanamo? Do you remember that? A few years ago, everyone basically agreed that Guantanamo needed to be shut down. Barack Obama was in favor of that. John McCain was in favor of that. George W. Bush was in favor of that. And then something weird happened. Barack Obama became president. He adopted the idea. He actually tried to do it. He tried to take the steps to close Guantanamo. And Republicans balked. They turned against something they used to be for. They started talking about President Obama wanting to let terrorists loose in your neighborhood. Do you remember that? Well, after that, the health reform battle came along. And again, Republicans started arguing against something that they used to be for. In the case of health reform, that something was their idea in the first place, the idea of an individual mandate so that people have to buy health insurance. That's a Republican idea. That was the Republican alternative to President Clinton's health reform proposal in the 90s. It was the basis of Mitt Romney's health reform plan in Massachusetts. It was something that Republicans like Chuck Grassley said they supported as recently as last year. Then President Obama adopted the idea, and Republicans started attacking it as unconstitutional. They turned against something they used to be for. Then Congress started debating the idea of creating a bipartisan deficit commission. And it looked like that was going to pass until 7 Republicans who used to support that idea changed their minds and backed out after President Obama said he wanted to adopt it. They turned against something they used to be for. Same thing happened with PAYGO, the pay-as-you-go budgeting rules for Congress. This was something Republicans had said they were for, but after President Obama adopted the idea and actually proposed it, Republicans turned against it. They're against something they used to be for. Well, that's the backdrop against which today President Obama came out and officially adopted yet another Republican idea.
Today we're announcing the expansion of offshore oil and gas exploration. My administration will consider potential areas for development in the Mid and South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico.
Offshore oil and gas drilling. As you probably recall, this is something that was not only a Republican idea, but a rather unimaginative Republican chant throughout the presidential election campaign in 2008. During the Republican National Convention, you might recall. You would have been forgiven for thinking that John McCain was running solely on a drill now platform.
The right course is the one championed by Ronald Reagan 30 years ago and by John McCain and Sarah Palin today. The immediate drilling for more oil off our shores.
He'll do it with an all-of-the-above approach, including nuclear power, and yes, offshore oil drilling. Drill, baby, drill. Drill, baby, drill.
We will drill new wells offshore, and we'll drill them now.
Let me make it very clear. Drill, baby, drill, and drill now.
Now that President Obama has come out in favor of that, what do you think the Republican response is? Well, naturally, the top Republican in the House, John Boehner, blasted the idea, saying, quote, "The Obama administration continues to defy the will of the American people." John Boehner saying that even though the president's in favor of offshore drilling now, he's obviously not in favor of it enough. The number 3 House Republican, Mike Pence, also blasted the decision today, saying the president's announcement today is a smokescreen. Unfortunately, this is yet another feeble attempt to gain votes for the president's national energy tax bill that is languishing in the Senate. Now, not all Republicans have reacted like this today. The president appears to have bamboozled Republicans a little bit, actually, by giving them what they said they wanted. Alongside the negative reactions from people like John Boehner and Mike Pence came mildly positive statements from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator John McCain, and even Senator James Inhofe. But man does not govern by press release alone. The real question is whether Obama's big concession to Republicans on policy means that he will actually get Republican votes for his energy bill. The White House obviously hopes that will be the case. In leaking this news to the New York Times last night, administration officials who did not want to be named said that the announcement today was intended to, among other things, win political support for comprehensive energy and climate legislation. Democratic Senator John Kerry, whose job is to get that legislation through the Senate, tried to be optimistic about this today as well. His office saying, quote, "In the difficult work of putting together a 60-vote coalition, Senator Kerry has put aside his own longtime policy objections and has been willing to explore potential energy sources off our coasts." Here's the question, though. Senator Kerry and President Obama willing to put away their longtime stated objections to this Republican idea. In exchange for what? Last month, President Obama gave in to another Republican energy demand, cleared the way for more nuclear power plants to be built in this country. In exchange for what? It's one thing to be willing to compromise on specific things in order to make a bill good enough to pass. But that only makes sense if you are getting something in exchange for making that bill less perfect. What are President Obama and Democrats getting here exactly? Well, joining us now is Chris Hayes, the Washington editor for The Nation magazine. Chris, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Rachel.
So in health reform, Democrats took stuff like single payer off the table before the negotiations really even began. This time around on climate change, they've given in on nuclear power, they've given in on offshore drilling. Why start out making concessions in exchange for nothing from the other side?
Well, that's a fine question. I'm sort of with you on this. I mean, I think the most charitable interpretation possible is that the president is a real believer in honest negotiation, and time again, he is going to try to will that to be the case, will those to be the facts of the matter, that he is dealing in a situation of honest, good faith negotiation, and so as to deal in that situation, he acts as if those conditions obtained, and he gives good faith concessions up front, expecting that somehow the magical negotiation fairy will show up and prompt the Republicans to similarly act in good faith. So far, that has never been reciprocated, but, you know, I think that's the most charitable interpretation. The other interpretation is just, you know, poor politics and malpractice.
Well, the magical negotiation fairy is something who I have long believed in.
Yes, yeah.
Who gave me quarters in exchange for my teeth as a child. We had a strange family.
You settled the price.
It would make sense to be doing this way if it hadn't worked out so poorly in health reform. I mean, surely health reform passed, right? And that's the bottom line, and that's maybe all they care about. But the Democrats spent months, they spent essentially an entire year chasing Republican votes and watering down the bill, and they ended up having to put the bill together with only Democratic support in the end anyway, having done a ton of work, wasted a ton of time, and lost a lot of support from their base in doing so. Isn't that the lesson from health reform?
Well, you and I think that's a lesson. And in fact, I think the lesson of healthcare reform is go with reconciliation and use it from the beginning. I mean, cap and trade is a revenue bill. I mean, most of it can be done through reconciliation. And the lesson was that when you go through reconciliation, all of a sudden you have 8 votes to play with. I will say this in their favor. In this case, if you're not going to do reconciliation, it's a 59-vote scenario. It's not the 60-vote pre-Brown universe. And unlike healthcare reform, you do have Lindsey Graham, who's a co-signer on the legislation currently. And that, I mean, that is a big difference. There was never any Republican, and now I don't know if when push comes to shove, Lindsey Graham's going to be voting for this thing, but there was never any Republican similarly headlining healthcare reform. And so they can make a plausible case there's more of an area for bipartisan cooperation here.
Bipartisan cooperation. Talk about a magical fairy. Bipartisan cooperation here. I mean, the Republican response to this today was all over the map. You know, John Boehner slamming President Obama for defying the will of the people.
Right.
Those moderately positive statements from McConnell and Graham and from John McCain. Do you think that the strategy makes sense at all if Republicans ultimately don't vote for this, if this doesn't produce a Lindsey Graham vote? Is there some broader way in which this is the way the president wants to look to the American people and he wants to make Republicans look unreasonable?
Right. So the other interpretation is exactly that, right? Politically, the idea is you're constantly extending an olive branch and you're constantly getting slapped in the face. And eventually, you do that enough, the American people realize who's the one operating in good faith, who's the one operating in bad faith. The problem with that is that might be good for the president's approval ratings, but it produces bad legislation. And more insidiously, it moves the center of debate to the right. We've seen this time and time again. If you step to the right and they step to the right, well, then the center moves to the right. So all of a sudden, like he said on Guantanamo, or things particularly in the national security state, things that were kind of settled centrist ideas like we shouldn't torture or we should close Guantanamo. In trying to kind of move towards them, you've shifted the parameters of the conversation over. And I think, what we ended up with was a kind of center-right healthcare bill, Romney care essentially for the whole United States. You worry that that's what's going to be the end result of this sort of ideological feint here with climate change legislation.
Well, and of course the other thing going on here, and this I think fits with that overall dynamic of the country sort of scooting to the right, even with Democrats in charge, is that this really was the president, the administration, giving the Democratic Party's base just the back of the hand today. I mean, they not only didn't fight for what environmentalists would have wanted him to fight for here, the administration preemptively gave it up for nothing. Do they just not care what the base thinks? Do they see political advantage actively in messing with the base like this?
Yeah, this is on the internet known as the punch the hippie strategy, which I think is always applauded here in Washington because